Pauline epistles, which include 13 books in the New Testament traditionally attributed to Paul the Apostle, have been central to Christian theology and practice for a long time. However, modern scholarship has raised significant doubts about the authenticity of many of these epistles, challenging long-held beliefs about their authorship and reliability. Bart Ehrman points out that half of the letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament were likely not written by him. This view reflects the extent to which scholars have questioned traditional assumptions about Pauline authorship. The epistles traditionally linked to Paul are generally divided into three categories: undisputed letters, disputed letters, and pastoral epistles. Most scholars agree that 7 epistles were genuinely written by Paul: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. The authenticity of the remaining 6 is highly contested. Scholar Robert Price argues that we cannot be certain of Pauline authorship for any single epistle. While this level of skepticism isn't universally accepted, it shows that there's deep debate over the authorship in New Testament studies regarding Paul's epistles. The disputed letters, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians, and the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, face particularly strong skepticism. Burton L. Mack suggests that the differences in vocabulary, style, and thought between these letters and the undisputed ones are too significant to be attributed to development in Paul's thinking. Many scholars agree, noting significant discrepancies between these letters and the core Pauline corpus. For instance, Ephesians shows a stage of theological development beyond what is found in the undisputed letters. The letter's long sentences, its use of ecclesia to refer to the universal church, and its close relationship with the Colossians have held many to question its authority. Scholar Andrew T. Lincoln points out that the linguistic and theological differences make it hard to attribute Ephesians directly to Paul. The pastoral epistles face even stronger skepticism. Many scholars, including Howard Marshall, note that the vocabulary and style of these letters differ markedly from the undisputed Pauline letters. A significant portion of the vocabulary in these epistles is not used elsewhere in the Pauline corpus or the New Testament. This linguistic divergence, combined with the more developed ecclesiastical structure described in these letters, leads many to conclude they were written after Paul's lifetime. The question of authorship for these disputed and pastoral epistles also brings up the broader issue of pseudepigraphy in the early Christian writings. Some scholars that pseudepigraphy was common and accepted in antiquity, but this view is challenged by others. Ehrman, for instance, argues that ancient people took forgery seriously and considered it a form of lying, casting a shadow over the ethical implications of potential pseudepigraphy in the New Testament. David G. Mead offers a more nuanced view, suggesting that pseudepigraphy was a complex phenomenon with varying degrees of acceptability depending on the genre and purpose of the writing. Nevertheless, if some of the Pauline epistles are, in fact, pseudepigraphical, it raises serious questions about the integrity of early Christian writers and the reliability of the New Testament as a whole. The implications of possible pseudepigraphy in the Pauline corpus are significant. Scholars like John Dominic Cresson and Jonathan L. Reed argue that the real question is which letters are genuinely from Paul, not whether we have letters from Paul. Question of which one. This uncertainty undermines traditional understandings of Pauline theology and early Christian thought. If significant portions of the Pauline corpus were not actually written by Paul, our understanding of Paul's teachings becomes uncertain. Moreover, how can texts be considered divinely inspired if they were written under false pretenses? These concerns are further complicated by apparent contradictions within the Pauline corpus. Charles A. Wanamaker notes that the eschatology of 2nd Thessalonians appears to contradict that of 1st Thessalonians, suggesting either a significant shift in Paul's thinking or different authorship. These contradictions extend to areas such as Christology, ecclesiology, and soteriology, further undermining the coherence of Pauline theology. The relationship between Paul's writings and other New Testament texts also raises critical questions. Scholar E.P. Sanders argues that Paul's theology represents a significant departure from the teachings of Jesus as presented in the Gospels, highlighting the theological gap between Jesus and Paul. This has led some, like Robert M. Price, to suggest that Paul, rather than Jesus, might be considered the true founder of Christianity. The idea that Paul might be considered the true founder of Christianity challenges traditional Christian understandings of Christian origins. Let's take a deeper look at this claim. So, if we consider the chronology of the New Testament texts, scholars like Bart Ehrman notes that the earliest Christian writings we have are actually Paul's letters, dated from around 50 CE onwards. This places Paul's writings significantly earlier than the Gospels, which are traditionally dated to between 70 to 100 CE. Scholars like John Dominic Crossan and Jonathan L. Reed emphasize that Paul's letters are our earliest Christian documents, written at least a decade before the earliest Gospel. This chronology suggests that Paul's interpretation of Jesus and his message was already influencing Christian communities before the Gospels were written. Burton L. Mack argues that the Gospels were written in and for communities shaped by Paul's preaching and letters. This raises questions about the historical accuracy of the Gospels. If the Gospel writers were influenced by Pauline theology, how reliable are their accounts as historical documents about Jesus? The language of our earliest manuscripts also suggests that the Gospels may not have been written by the individuals traditionally associated with them. Ehrman points out that our earliest manuscripts of the Gospels are in Greek, not Aramaic or Hebrew. This linguistic evidence raises questions about the traditional attributions, particularly for Matthew, Mark, and John, who are typically thought to have been Aramaic-speaking followers of Jesus. Scholar Maurice Casey elaborates that the Greek of the Gospels is not translation Greek, but composition Greek, indicating that the authors were Greek-speaking Christians, not the Aramaic-speaking disciples of Jesus. To understand Casey's point, it's important to distinguish between translation Greek and composition Greek. Translation Greek would show signs of Aramaic or Hebrew influence, expected if the authors were translating Aramaic traditions into Greek. Composition Greek, however, displays natural Greek syntax and idioms, suggesting the authors were thinking and writing in Greek from the outset. This has profound implications for our understanding of the Gospel's relationship to the oral traditions supposedly passed down by the apostles who knew Jesus. These apostles, primarily uneducated Galilean Jews, would have spoken Aramaic rather than Greek. Scholar John P. Meyer notes that the earliest disciples of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking Jews from Galilee, unlikely to have been fluent in Greek. The use of composition Greek in the Gospels suggests that their authors were not directly relying on this Aramaic oral tradition, but were working within a Greek-speaking Christian context removed from the original eyewitnesses. This linguistic evidence points to the conclusion that the authors of the canonical Gospels were likely detached from the Jewish apostolic tradition, inventing their own tradition based on Pauline Christology. Burton L. Mack argues that the Gospels were written by Christians who knew nothing about the historical Jesus, except what they had heard in the myths of Christ cultivated by various Christian communities. This suggests that the Gospel authors were working within a Hellenized Christian context rather than drawing on authentic Jewish apostolic traditions. The claim of apostolic authority, particularly that descended from Peter, is thus called into question. Ehrman points out that the Gospels are anonymous works, written in a different language than Jesus, in distant lands after Jesus' original followers were dead, by people who never knew him and had only heard stories about him. Moreover, the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70 CE likely played a role in the fabrication of apostolic authority. Paula Fredrickson argues that in the wake of the Jewish War, Gentile Christianity, with its Pauline theology, emerged as the dominant form of the new religion, largely unchecked by Jerusalem Church's authority. This historical context provided an opportunity for Gentile Christian communities to assert their own authority in the absence of the Jerusalem-centered movement. The Greek writing in the Gospels also raises questions about the fidelity of the Gospel narratives to Jesus' original teachings and actions. Gerd Thiessen and Annette Mers argue that the Greek composition of the Gospels represents a significant removal from the Aramaic background of Jesus and his first followers, introducing the possibility of substantial reinterpretation and adaptation of the original traditions. This has far-reaching implications for our understanding of the Gospel's original origins and reliability as historical documents. The use of composition Greek in the Gospels also aligns with what we know about the spread of early Christianity. Wayne Meeks notes that the rapid spread of the Jesus movement in the Greco-Roman world necessitated the use of Greek as the primary language of communication. This historical context helps explain why the Gospels would have been composed in Greek, even if their source material may have originated in Aramaic-speaking communities. The growth of Gentile Greek-speaking converts, largely due to Paul's mission, played a crucial role in shaping early Christianity. Wayne Meeks argues that Paul's mission to the Gentiles created a new social and cultural context for the Jesus movement, one that was more receptive to Hellenistic concepts and practices. Meeks' analysis highlights how Paul's work fundamentally altered the cultural and philosophical framework of early Christianity, moving it away from its Jewish roots and towards a more Hellenistic worldview. One of the most significant developments in this Hellenistic-influenced Christianity was the concept of Jesus as a divine figure. Scholar Larry Hurtado suggests that Paul's high Christology, which presents Jesus as a pre-existent divine figure, represents a significant departure from Jewish messianic expectations and likely influenced later gospel accounts. Hurtado's observation points to a fundamental shift in how Jesus was understood, from a Jewish messianic figure to a divine being within a Greco-Roman religious framework. This shift is evident in the theological content of Paul's letters compared to the teachings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. Scholar James D.G. Dunn notes that while Jesus' teachings focus on the coming kingdom of God, Paul's letters emphasize the death and resurrection of Jesus as the central elements of faith. This theological divergence suggests that Paul's interpretation of Jesus' significance was distinct from that of the earliest followers of Jesus, further complicating our understanding of early Christian theology. Paul's role in shaping early Christian theology cannot be overstated. Scholar E.P. Sanders argues that Paul's theology, particularly his understanding of justification by faith and the inclusion of Gentiles in the covenant community, represents a radical departure from traditional Jewish thought. Sanders' analysis highlights how Paul's theological innovations laid the groundwork for distinctly Christian identity separate from Judaism. The creation of a new religious identity also involved the reinterpretation of Jewish scriptures. Richard B. Hayes argued that Paul reinterpreted Jewish scriptures in light of his Christological convictions, transforming their meaning to fit his theological framework. Hayes' observation underscores the extent to which Paul's theological innovations influenced the development of early Christian doctrine. The Hellenistic influence on early Christian writings, particularly the Gospels and Paul's letters, has been a topic of intense concern for many scholars. Researchers argue that the influences corrupted the original true message of Christ. Helmut Keister, in his analysis of the New Testament, emphasizes the Hellenistic context of the Gospels. He notes that the Gospels are literary compositions that are at home in the world of Hellenistic literature. While Keister sees this as an integration of literary techniques, it could be argued that this blending with Greco-Roman biographical traditions compromised the purity of the original message. The Gospel writers, in an attempt to make Jesus' story resonate with a Hellenistic audience, adopted elements that were foreign to Jewish tradition, thereby introducing ideas that were not part of Jesus' teachings. The influence of Hellenistic thought on Paul's writings is equally concerning. Troel Zangberg Peterson highlights how Paul's ideas often parallel Stoic philosophy, noting significant similarities between Paul's ethics and his idea of the pneuma, spirit, and Stoic concepts of reason and pneuma. This parallel suggests that Paul's theology was significantly influenced by Hellenistic philosophy, potentially diluting the original Jewish teachings. Paul's engagement with Hellenistic ideas might have led him to reinterpret and transform the message of Christ in ways that were more palatable to a Gentile audience, but less faithful to the original doctrine. The concept of a divine figure becoming human to save humanity, while familiar in Hellenistic thought, was foreign to Jewish messianic expectations and potentially introduced theological distortions. Charles Talbert argues that the gospel narratives draw on Hellenistic divine man traditions, presenting Jesus in ways reminiscent of Hellenistic stories about divine men who mediate between the divine and human realms. This adaptation could be seen as an imposition of pagan myths onto the story of Jesus, thereby corrupting the original narrative with elements that were not part of Jewish tradition. Gregory J. Riley elaborates on how Hellenistic concepts shape the portrayal of Jesus, noting that the Hellenistic hero was often a liminal figure, part human and part divine. The Gospel writers drew on this tradition to present Jesus as both fully human and fully divine, a concept alien to Jewish thought but very familiar to Gentile converts. This dual nature of Jesus, while making the new faith more accessible to Hellenistic converts, diverged sharply from Jewish expectations and may have introduced significant theological errors. The depiction of Jesus as a divine-human hybrid reflects a syncretism that distorts the original monotheistic and messianic vision found in Jewish teachings. The idea of a suffering and dying Messiah, central to Christian theology, was particularly at odds with Jewish expectations and might have been a result of Hellenistic influences. Geza Vermes argues that the idea of a Messiah who would suffer and die for the sins of mankind was totally alien to all known pre-Christian Jewish thought. This indicates that concepts were likely foreign imports to Christian theology, not derived from Jesus' original message. Jewish messianic hopes focused on political and national restoration, not spiritualized universal salvation, that was later promoted by Hellenistic-influenced Christianity. N.T. Wright explains that the first-century Jews were not expecting the end of the space-time universe, but the end of the present evil age and the inauguration of the age to come within history. This contrast emphasizes the extent to which Hellenistic influences reshaped Christian theology in ways that were incongruent with Jewish expectations. It also suggests that Paul's Christology significantly influenced, or at least Paul's Hellenistic influences would have had a impact on how the Gentile Greek-speaking converts to Christianity would have interpreted the Jewish traditions or Jewish messianic prophecies such that they could account for, or at least adopt, their Hellenized version of Jesus. The Gospel of John in particular shows a strong Hellenistic philosophical influence. John Ashton argues that the Gospel's prologue, with its concept of the Logos, draws on both Jewish wisdom traditions and Greek philosophical concepts, particularly Stoic ideas about the divine reason permeating the universe. While Ashton views this synthesis positively, it can be argued that the introduction of the Logos concept represents a significant deviation from monotheistic beliefs, infusing Christian doctrine with Hellenistic philosophical elements that were alien to the original faith. Paul's letters also reflect a problematic blend of Jewish and Hellenistic thought. E.P. Sanders notes that Paul's theology represents a unique synthesis of Jewish apocalyptic expectations and Hellenistic philosophical concepts, particularly in his understanding of salvation and the nature of Christ. This synthesis, while unique, can be seen as a compromise that diluted the pure message of Jesus with Hellenistic ideas. Paul's depiction of Christ as a pre-existent divine figure echoes Hellenistic notions of divine intermediaries, which were not part of Jewish messianic expectations and thus represent a theological deviation. The development of Christology in early Christianity, presenting Jesus as a pre-existent divine figure, marks perhaps the most significant departure from Jewish messianic expectations. Larry Hurtado argues that the early Christian cult of Jesus represents a significant mutation in Jewish monotheistic tradition, influenced by Hellenistic concepts of divine intermediaries. This mutation, while facilitating the spread of Christianity among Gentiles, introduced significant theological distortions, moving away from the original monotheistic and messianic vision of Judaism. Essentially, modern Trinitarian Christianity as we know it was a sort of Pauline corruption that was completely unknown to the Jews of that time, and it was only popularized due to Paul's Greek-speaking audience sort of adopting it within their Hellenized Roman context. The book of Acts, often referred to just as Acts, is a crucial part of the New Testament, detailing the early years of the Christian church following Jesus' alleged resurrection and ascension. Traditionally, it is attributed to Luke, who was a companion of the Apostle Paul for some time. Acts is considered a continuation of the narrative started in the Gospel of Luke. However, there are many questions about its sources, historical accuracy, and the author's direct knowledge of the events and characters he describes. The authorship of Acts by Luke is widely accepted in Christian tradition based on internal evidence and early church testimonies, rather than any explicit self-identification within the text. The prologue to Acts is addressed to Theophilus, the same individual mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, suggesting a common authorship. Despite this, Luke does not explicitly state his method for gathering information or the extent of his personal involvement in the events depicted. This ambiguity opens the text to scrutiny, especially from a historical critical perspective. One significant point of contention is the source of Luke's information. Unlike the Pauline epistles, where Paul directly addresses his recipients and recounts his own experiences, Acts reads more like a historical account written from a third-person perspective. This raises the question, did Luke meet any of the principal figures he describes, such as Peter, James, or John? The text itself does not provide clear answers. For example, in Acts chapter 16, verse 10, there is a sudden shift to the first person plural we, suggesting the author may have joined Paul on some of his journeys. However, this we passage is not uniformly present throughout the narrative, leaving scholars to debate whether Luke was indeed an eyewitness to these particular events or simply employing a literary device. Some scholars, like Bart Ehrman, suggest that Acts often reads as if it were composed by someone removed from the events described, relying heavily on hearsay rather than direct testimony. Ehrman highlights that Luke never clarifies his sources, raising doubts about the accuracy of his accounts. For instance, the detailed conversations and speeches reported in Acts are suspect, given the improbability that Luke had access to such precise recollections, especially in the absence of modern recording methods. The portrayal of Paul in Acts also raises significant questions. The depiction of Paul's activities and theological positions in Acts sometimes diverges starkly from the accounts found in Paul's own epistles. For instance, in Acts, Paul is shown observing Jewish law and customs scrupulously, aligning closely with the Jerusalem apostles. This contrasts with the Paul of the epistles, who argues vehemently against the necessity of following Jewish law for Gentile converts. Scholar Gerd Ludemann suggests that these discrepancies indicate the author of Acts may have had theological motivations to present a more unified and orthodox image of early Christianity, smoothing over real conflicts and differences. Richard Purvo emphasizes the dramatic and sometimes novelistic elements of Acts, which further cast doubt on its historical reliability. The numerous miraculous events and seamless heroic portrayal of early Christian leaders resemble the stylized narratives common in ancient literature, rather than objective historical accounts. This stylization raises the question of whether Luke's primary aim was theological and edifying rather than historical, designed to inspire and instruct rather than document verifiable history. Examining the questions surrounding Luke's authorship and the portrayal of Paul in Acts, it is essential to delve deeper into the specific claims of miraculous events associated with Paul. These miraculous accounts are not merely anecdotal. They play a critical role in establishing Paul's apostolic authority and legitimacy within the early Christian community. For believers, Paul's ability to perform miracles or have miracles performed on him would be seen as undeniable proof of divine endorsement and the presence of the Holy Spirit working through him. Therefore, scrutinizing the historical reliability of these miracle stories is crucial for understanding both the construction of Paul's authority and the theological implications of these narratives. One of the most glaring issues in the narrative of Paul's miraculous deeds is the apostles' own silence on the matter. Throughout his extensive corpus of letters, which form a significant portion of the New Testament, Paul never explicitly mentions performing miracles. The silence is particularly puzzling given Paul's frequent need to defend his apostolic authority. In his letter to the Galatians, for instance, Paul goes to great lengths to establish his credentials as an apostle, yet he never appeals to miraculous deeds as evidence of his divine appointment. This discrepancy between Paul's self-representation and Luke's portrayal in Acts raises significant questions about the historical reliability of these miracle accounts. Equally telling is the absence of any acknowledgement of Paul's miracles by other apostles or early Christian leaders. In the various New Testament epistles attributed to Peter, James, John, and others, there is no mention of Paul's miraculous deeds. This lack of corroboration is particularly noteworthy given the importance that such acts would have held in establishing Paul's authority within the early Christian community. This absence of corroboration extends beyond the New Testament. Early Christian writings outside the canon, such as 1 Clement and the letters of Ignatius, which mention Paul, also fail to reference any miracles performed by him. The attribution of miracles to religious leaders was common practice in the ancient world, serving to legitimize their authority and divine connection. This context is crucial in understanding the miracle stories associated with Paul. Numerous other contemporary figures claimed miraculous powers, such as Apollonius of Tyana and Simon Magus. These parallel claims suggest a cultural environment where miraculous abilities were often attributed to religious and philosophical leaders. In the context of ancient literature and religious traditions, the miracles attributed to Paul in Acts can be viewed as part of a broader cultural phenomenon rather than as unique historical events. Luke's attribution of miraculous deeds to Paul is, in essence, unremarkable for its time. Acts describes figures like Simon the sorcerer as widely renowned for their magical abilities. It's worth noting that when such abilities are attributed to figures we support, they are often termed miracles rather than magic. From an agnostic perspective, the historical veracity of Paul's alleged miracles is highly questionable due to the complete lack of external evidence supporting these claims. It's likely that Luke's accounts went unchallenged by contemporaries because claims of miraculous abilities were commonplace during that era. For anyone approaching the text without preconceived notions about Paul's authority, the absence of corroborating evidence from multiple sources coupled with the prevalence of miracle claims in that historical context renders the historicity of Paul's miracles highly improbable. The miracles attributed to Paul in Acts bear similarities to stories prevalent in Hellenistic literature of the time. This suggests that the author of Acts may have been drawing from familiar literary tropes to craft Paul's image as a divinely empowered apostle. For example, Paul's healing of a lame man in Lystra echoes similar tales in Greek mythology, such as Asclepius healing the lame. Paul's survival of a shipwreck resonates with stories of divine protection in Greco-Roman literature, such as Odysseus' survival of numerous sea perils. Paul's exorcisms parallel common exorcism stories in Hellenistic literature. These literary parallels raise questions about the historical basis of these accounts. They suggest that the author of Acts may have been more concerned with presenting Paul in a way that would resonate with a Hellenistic audience than with providing a strictly historical account. A critical examination of historical sources reveals a complete absence of external or non-Pauline testimonies to the miracles allegedly performed by Paul. Contemporary Roman or Jewish sources, which one might expect to mention such extraordinary events, are silent on the matter. Historian Gerd Ludemann emphasizes this point, noting the silence of non-Christian sources about Paul's miracles. If Paul had indeed performed the kinds of public, spectacular miracles described in Acts, we would expect some mention of them in the writings of contemporary historians or in official records. This lack of external corroboration further weakens the historical case for Paul's miracles. Given the urban context of Paul's ministry, the silence is even more striking. Cities like Ephesus, Corinth, and Thessalonica were bustling metropolises, with diverse populations, active commerce, and significant religious and philosophical discourse. These urban centers were not isolated backwaters, but hubs of communication within the Roman Empire. They hosted numerous travelers, merchants, and officials who would have carried news and stories throughout the Mediterranean world. Moreover, these cities had their own local historians, civic records, and religious institutions that documented significant events. Given this context, the complete absence of any mention of Paul's alleged miracles in non-Christian sources is concerning. If Paul had indeed performed the kinds of miracle sorry, if Paul had indeed performed the kinds of public, spectacular miracles described in Acts, healing the sick, exorcising demons, or even raising the dead, it seems implausible that such events would go entirely unremarked upon by contemporary writers, local officials, or Roman administrators. The silence is not merely an absence of corroboration. It presents a significant challenge to the historical reliability of the miraculous accounts in Acts. It suggests that either these events did not occur as described or that their impact was far less significant than the narrative in Acts implies. Or perhaps Luke is attributing the miracles to him much later on to sort of as a claim or to support his apostolic authority. In the broader context of ancient literature and religious traditions, Luke's attribution of miracles to Paul and Acts is paradoxically unremarkable. Far from being a unique historical account, it adheres to a well-established literary and cultural convention of ascribing supernatural powers to religious leaders. This practice was so commonplace in the ancient world that it would have been more surprising if Luke had not included miraculous deeds in his portrayal of Paul. The complete absence of external corroboration for these alleged miracles, when combined with our understanding of ancient literary practices, leads to a compelling conclusion. The miraculous accounts in Acts are almost certainly literary constructions serving specific theological purposes rather than accurate historical reports. These narratives shouldn't be seen as reflections of Paul's unique abilities, but rather as manifestations of the expectations and narrative conventions of the time. They were crafted with a clear agenda to legitimize Paul's apostolic authority in a cultural milieu where such supernatural claims were not only common but expected of significant religious figures. Luke, in attributing these miracles to Paul, was not acting as a historian in the modern sense, but as a skilled narrator working within the literary conventions of his era to publish or establish Paul's credibility and divine mandate.